Good morning, everyone. I apologize for this unusual setup. I'm sorry that the weather has done this to us. I hope you can hear me okay, and I'll hope that Derwin can interrupt with the chat if you need better audio. I want to thank Derwin up there and Arina Kadam at NIMH for making this possible. I know we're running late, so I want to jump right in as soon as we can and get going with this actual content. So what I want to do this morning is to give you a little quick summary of, at least from my memory, where we've been with NIMH support for personality disorders and where we may be going in the future. And I'm going to just jump right into it with a little fanfare. The past trends I'm going to present as a snapshot, not of some decades-long history of NIMH support. I really want to start from my own experience at NIMH, which was in 1998 when I came as a program officer and became a branch chief for adult psych pathology, and my branch had most of the personality disorders work. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, we actually had a fairly robust personality disorders portfolio. Jim Greeling was our program officer. I'm sure many of you remember Jim, now retired, but did a super job in fostering this area, both the research and with the advocacy communities. And just as is diagnosed in clinics, the most common disorders were borderline and antisocial, and they got by far the most attention. Just a few of the highlights at that time is that right around 2000 through 2002, we actually had a pretty major push, especially about borderline. We had a big conference in 2001 in New York, co-sponsored with the Swiss Foundation that had a lot of money for a while and sort of went away. The International Borderline Personality Disorder Research Foundation, and we had people like Eric Kandel there and others talking about this. It was Rockefeller, and we even had a program whereby the funding awards for that foundation were actually, the applications were reviewed in-house by our own NIMH review branch, so we were really collaborating very closely. It's the only time I've ever personally seen that happen. Then in the next year in Minneapolis in 2002, we had another conference co-sponsored with that foundation on new direction for research in borderline personality disorder. And to some extent in the prior meeting, there was an emphasis on getting young investigators involved and fostering translational approaches. That time, one of our innovations was to have a requirement that you had to have one basic and one clinical scientist on the branch to ensure that there was sort of a translational pairing. And again, also in 2002, there was a conference that I think Terry Hoffman headed, on family perspectives in borderline personality disorder. So there's a lot going on, and again, with the 15-year hindsight, one has to say we didn't see all we might have hoped for in terms of new breakthroughs. Certainly there was more attention to borderline and more clinical work, but we really didn't see the progress we might have hoped for with that kind of push. One of the things that was going on clearly at that time was the start of the emergence, or really I should say not the start, but the burgeoning of the emergence from strictly thinking of these as descriptive clinical diagnoses, thinking about dimensional problems. This is reflected, for instance, in a lecture I gave to an NIH class back in 2003, which was not my conception, but rather summarizing the work of Andy Sobel and others, looking at the clinical sorts of dimensions involved in borderline. You can see there, I was trying to make the point to the class that you could think of borderline personality disorder as located in a sort of three-dimensional space based upon the three major axes of disturbed relationships, impulsivity, and affective dysregulation. And all of these, even though they were mostly on the basis of the clinical scores of various measures, could be thought of as dimensions, and this borderline wasn't a specific disease entity, but rather was part of this overall pattern of these different dimensions that was located in a specific space in that overall three-dimensional space. So going on from there, this, clearly that dimensional idea was becoming popular in the field, and this is a slide that's not my slide, actually. Psychiatric Association's grant for the scientific basis for DSM-5, of which I was actually the program officer at that time. There were, as you know, several conferences. There was about dimensional models and theology. So the slides, these are a couple of slides that I will show them from this conference. And again, they're diving right into saying that they're not just thinking about clinical symptoms per se, but really talking about temperament as the foundation both of normal personality, but also of mental disorders across the board, the common mental disorders, not just personality disorders, with depression, anxiety, and so forth. And so there was a lot of discussion of the hierarchical structure of temperament and of the disorders. There, for instance, is data from Bob Kruger and others talking about an externalizing factor with many different facets under that overall externalizing factor. And if you look at the behavioral genetics, you get very high loading for the high order factor, even though individual facets like substance abuse, antisocial behavior, just plain uninhibited personality, and so forth, might have smaller correlations. The overall externalizing factor loaded very highly in terms of behavioral genetics. So clearly this kind of movement from that conference went on to become the leading trend for what the committee was recommending for personality disorders in DSM-5. But again, a slide from this conference clearly showed that the people at that conference and the subsequent meetings were worried about the idea that you can't just say, okay, here are our big four that we're going to use. So particular big four shown at the bottom here, as you can see. The question is, now what do we do? How do we assess actual distress and impairment severity on these scales, and what would these scales look like even? We can't just say, okay, we have these basic personality traits, let's go for it. And so all of you know better than I do, since I am not a personality disorders expert or don't spend all my time in this area, about the ultimately disappointing results, how hard people worked, and that the scientific committee recommended it, but ultimately the trustees voted that down, and we were left with the DSM-4 personality disorders, and the new hybrid categorical and dimensional model was relegated to Section 3. And so the outcome of this, I think, was both confusion and dissatisfaction for one, in terms of clinicians and wondering, well, we can still use this, but we know that the scientists are really thinking in a different way. So where are we? We're left in this sort of purgatory or limbo or something for what we should do. And certainly, second, this created a lot of uncertainty clearly about future research directions. NIMH understandably didn't really want to fund the old classical personality disorders, considering that the scientific community was clearly not behind those kinds of approaches anymore. But yet it wasn't really clear, there wasn't a clear signal from APA as to the fact that this would have clinical utility as yet. I think the result of that was that starting about then, there was a big drop even in the late 2000s for personality disorder applications, and 2010 to 2012 as people could see this problem happening for personality disorder applications. So, what I'm trying to do here is sort of describe a narrative arc. I'm not trying to delve into the details, but rather present my view of these trends that have been happening across the past decade. So with that disappointing outcome from the DSM, on the other hand, the ICD-11 went forward successfully with a somewhat similar model. And this group was headed by Dr. Peter Tyrer of London. Again, from one of his recent papers talking about this with that bracing British frankness that we can all admire. One of his papers just boldly said the current classification clearly has no clinical utility. High comorbidity is clearly a false separation among the various disorders as they are currently named, and that the dissatisfaction in the clinical literature sends a clear message that from clinicians, a plague on your classification, it does not represent what I see in my clinic. And so this group went ahead to actually implement a change that's very relevant of what the DSM committee did, but they actually went ahead and implemented it. So as you know, again, better than I, but just to putting this placeholder in the narrative arc, there were these ideas of general guidelines for personality disorder diagnosis, but not having to name one, but simply say there's a PD with 3 levels of severity, as you can see. And there's also the strong possibility that they will go with 5 domains of functioning, very similar to the Big 5 sort of model. Again, very much based on extremes of normal personality and the familiar Big 5 there. So again, this reflects the same DSM trend that rather than looking simply at disorders, they are considering the disorders in terms of extremes of normal personality functioning. And that's an important point for how we see things from NIMH. Also, the ICD-11 group is strongly considering whether they should just have a dichotomous rating for those big five factors, that, negative affectivity, sort of yes or no, or whether they should have a polygamous rating with 5 levels. And they are actually doing a clinical trial to look at that and to see if the clinical utility is satisfactory for that, or whether, like the DSM, they'll say, well, that's going too far. It's too hard for clinicians to make those distinctions, but at least they can check whether we have a yes or no for the social disinhibition, etc. So the point I want to make here is that clearly we are going in this translational direction to think about the disorders in terms of deviations from normal functioning. And so we can see that both the DSM-5 and ICD-11 are moving in this direction towards translational ways. And this is coming from the people revising the diagnostic manuals. From the point of view of NIMH, one of the concerns we've had is that while this is a laudable trend and we think this is a good idea, at the same time, these personalities are mostly derived from very broad-based, largely self-report trait measures. And at the Institute, under Tom Insull's leadership, and clearly under Steve Hyman's before him and Josh Gordon's after Dr. Insull, NIMH has had an emphasis on including biological measures into the mix and helping to contribute toward the etiology. Some people think that this is just straight reductionism, and sometimes it's named smack of that. But really what we're about is trying to integrate the biological measurements and the behavioral measurements. The biological and the behavioral measurements. And another way for me to think about this is to advance the integration of neural systems and behavioral systems also across the traditional axis 1 disorders and personality disorders. As we begin to understand the biological concomitants of all these things, clearly there's not a separate set of neural systems for axis 1 disorders and for personality disorders. It's all the same brain out there, and we can begin to think about how this all works. And I'm certainly not advocating that we should just fold personality disorders into the other systems, but clearly there's a tremendous amount of overlap that will help us think about these things in a more cohesive way. So with that, where we're going, I think, with the research domain criteria is really, I hope that sets the perspective to say RDOC could be understood as very much a reflection of trends that you've seen with the evolution of the views of personality disorders, but also advancing biology and thinking about integrating that into this translational mix as well. So for us, if we look at our mission is to reduce the burden of suffering for mental disorders through research, the problems with the symptom-based ICD and DSM systems are clear, and exactly what Tyra was talking about. We understand that our disorders are not specific disease entities, but broad syndromes. They are highly heterogeneous and reflect high comorbidity, and nothing is more true than for personality disorders. But unfortunately, even though these are not specific disease entities, they have become strongly reified, as Steve Hyman has written about. And so for review, it becomes the case that you pretty much have to specify a DSM disorder in order to get funded. Increasingly also, we understand that our disorders are not dichotomous, but like personality dimensions, are actually dimensional in severity. So the problem has been running up through all the 80s, 90s, and 2000s after the release of DSM-3, that if we could simply study things the way investigators want to, that would be fine. But in fact, the categories have come to drive our entire biomedical research system for psychiatry, notably getting research grants, getting published, getting clinical trials and regulatory agency approval, and so forth. So RDOC was designed to develop a framework for studying psychopathology based on dimensions of observable behavior and neurobiological measures, two things together, neither with prominence, but both of those together. With four major components of four major subparts to actually posit what these fundamental dimensions or components are, to determine the full range of variation from normal to abnormal, very much, again, relevant of the approach to personality disorders, to integrate across a number of units of measurement, not in order to reduce them down to the lowest molecular or genetic levels, but rather to put different measurements together, since we know they often don't go very well, and to develop reliable and valid measures of these components that we can use. And I think, again, for personality disorders, it's important to say that sometimes a neglected aspect of RDOC in the field that we think is important is that it includes 4 components. First, neurodevelopment is critical, and we need to understand that. And then we need to understand the effects of the environment as that interacts with neurodevelopment. And the little snapshots there indicate, of course, that the effects of the environment can vary strongly depending on the particular points in development at which environmental events occur for good or for ill. And only within this important development environment context will we understand the actual domains of the research domain criteria and the units of analysis. I hope I'm not going through this too quickly, but with our late start, I certainly am very mindful of the time, so I hope all of you are familiar with RDOC. This is fairly familiar, and those of you who aren't so familiar can at least follow along. So here is what I've often thought to be the major part of RDOC, which I say is just 2 of the important parts, but certainly we need to pay attention to development in the environment as well. So here are the domains on the left column there, negative valence, positive valence, etc., with the specific constructs underneath. The constructs are those specific dimensions that were referred to in the overall RDOC mission statement. And then the units of analysis. And those units of analysis are heuristics. They are not taken to be, the really important ones carved in stone. Rather, we just want to integrate across lots of units of analysis, and this seems like this sort of heuristic convenient grouping. But for instance, self-reports could include scales that subjects or patients fill out, clinicians' ratings, and so forth. And so you can see there are some of the kinds of symptoms that we actually see within each of the domains. One of the important things here, and that I think, again, is important for personality disorders, given that they have so often been described almost purely psychologically, is that the RDOC constructs are intended to constrain the development of new constructs and sort of the proliferation of diagnostic and biological notions by saying that we want to look at different functions and to relate those functions to particular neural systems that play a major role in implementing them. For instance, amygdala efferents in fear, the ventral striatum in reward-related behavior, etc. So an RDOC construct is defined only when you can specify data for some function and you can specify data for a neural circuit or system that plays a major role in implementing that function. And so we hope that this rules out this quickly saying, well, we have this, that, and the other psychological function. And the other hand, that we say, well, we found this new circuit and we think that must be really important, so we'll make some diagnostic criterion on that basis. But rather, we're trying to work on brain behavior relationships in some systematic way. And also, again, RDOC really embodies this dimensional approach, looking at not simply disorders as in the red left tail there versus super healthy controls as in the green, but really looking at the whole span in the yellow area where people transition from slightly subpar functioning to clearly impaired levels is of particular interest. And the little breakpoint with the red slashes there is just simply meant to indicate that we don't necessarily see this as linear, but in fact one point of studying things dimensionally is to look for breakpoints or failure modes or whatever where things do deteriorate quickly. And with our relatively arbitrarily dichotomous classifications now, we may really be sort of missing that and certainly don't pay attention to that in an etiological sense. It's important to say that the framework is always under construction. This is not at all meant to be an alternative nosology, and we said, okay, these are the constructs. Rather, they're considered exemplars. Here's how you might go at it, and here are ones that are sort of predefined because there's good evidence for them, but we really encourage people to develop new constructs. That's important to bear in mind. So just a couple of updates. We've had 2 council work groups, one to vet changes to the matrix, just as I just mentioned. We really want to see this change, and we have a systematic way of doing that with 2 co-chairs from our advisory council who are convening a working group that will screen proposed changes, recruit subject matter experts as needed in particular areas to vet those changes, and then give the advisory council final reports and recommendations for actually implementing changes to the matrix. We're also moving forward rapidly to develop new RDOC tasks and measures. There was a working group headed by Ian Navarch and Maria Kendall. Maria perhaps is there today. And they did a great job in developing, as best they could, a list of 2 to 4 tasks and measures for each construct and to evaluate the psychometric evidence for those constructs, with the idea that these could particularly well serve as common data elements for large studies. And I hope that you have the slides there, so I hope some of you can get that link if you wish, or else you can find that on the website. Also, in terms of future activities, clearly RDOC, among other things, is going in a large end data direction, looking for large cohort studies that we can employ. That's not the only way we're going, but that's one important new direction, and that's why we need the common data elements that we can look across different studies that we might want to integrate, and we have a very advanced database, the RDOC database, to do that. And again, this involves new sampling frames, not simply looking at DSM definitions, but other ways of defining large samples, often on the basis of simply unlimited populations or screening for high-risk areas without being a specific diagnosis. We're also interested in looking at short-term longitudinal studies to examine trajectories. I'll give you a brief example of that in a bit. And we're really interested in moving towards preemption and prevention. With this dimensional approach, if we can looking at before they develop purely clinical levels of pathology, we may be able to do a better job for treatment. I'm hearing something coming back in my audio now. So is somebody wanting to mention time or other constraints? Okay, hearing none, I'll keep an ear open, but meanwhile I'll keep going. We started at 10:30 or so I'm hoping that I might have till about 11:15 here, so I'm kind of going forward on that basis. Another thing that we're really interested in, and that Dr. Gordon strongly supports, are formal computational approaches, computational neuroscience or psychiatry, and we're moving ahead with those sorts of things, which are, of course, sort of an umbrella for various measures, such as the BSNP study that some of you may have seen in AJT last year. So I want to cover a few misunderstandings with this approach, and again, these are relevant for personality disorders as for everything else. First, I hope I've convinced you that we do not ignore the environment and development. We've left it open and unspecified to give people flexibility to do what they want. But again, we're not ignoring it. Some people complain that they can't do what they want to do because the matrix doesn't have the construct they want. And I hope again that it's clear that we are encouraging the study of new constructs. People, if they study a new construct, need to define the data that would support that construct, the preliminary data, to go forward with it, but we certainly want to encourage new constructs. People also somehow have the idea that they can't study interactions between the constructs, and again, that's simply not true. We encourage that and understand that even a research classification system is sort of an artificial device that is a heuristic to help people design studies, so we actually want to see interactions. People have complained that with the biology and the matrix that RDOC is reductionistic and we ignore psychology or experiential factors. Again, we're thinking in an integrative way, not in a reductionistic way, and symptom reports, patient reports of experience, behavioral paths, all of those are seen as critical. I'll say a few words about that in a moment. People also have the idea that you have to study multiple disorders in a DSM sense to do RDOC, and that's not true. In fact, people can study a single disorder. We would encourage them to study multiple disorders where relevant. And again, that's, I think, especially important for personality disorders where there is so much heterogeneity and comorbidity, but you don't have to. People have complained that RDOC is not ready for the clinic yet, and here we would agree. It is a research framework, not a nosology that is intended to be ready to compete. And in fact, we've never intended it to compete. Rather, it's a research framework to try to inform future versions of DSM and ICD. So let me just jump on to some of the things, having briefly addressed some misunderstandings. Let me list some of the hazards that we see, or challenges, should I say, in implementing RDOC. First of all, what you might call the grain size, that is, if we go away from our DSM disorders and to emphasize these different kinds of dimensions, what's the right granularity for looking at assessment and successful treatment? For instance, people talk about anhedonia, but within anhedonia, there are different components: effort evaluation, reward prediction error, reward learning, responsiveness to reward. And so, is anhedonia okay? And is that a reasonable clinical construct to use, or do we need to dive deeper? That's just one example of many. Another issue here is relating the kinds of RDOC dimensional measures to clinical symptoms and outcomes. Again, this is really no different than that slide that I showed from Leanna Clark above, talking about how they would take the big four and how they would develop clinical symptoms and relate that to actual outcomes of trials. And another thing is that if you do have these clinical continuous phenomena, how do you determine the particular cut points to say that you have moderate, minor, severe levels and to adjust treatments particularly? Clearly, you still have to have cut points for decision-making in clinical practice. And also how to integrate across biological and behavioral measures in a way that's useful and heuristic and not simply confusing. So one of the things I want to summarize here is that, again, some of this confusion, I think, comes from the fact that a major reason for developing RDOC, the major reason, was that we needed to do something different in evaluating research grants. As I mentioned at the outset, the whole problem was that the essentially de facto requirement to use DSM disorders was stifling our research. And so we needed to devise new standards for peer review to help investigators feel free to look at the kinds of issues they wanted to explore. On the other hand, if you don't use the DSM, you have to have some standards and guidelines for evaluating research grants. You can't simply say to people, use something different than the DSM. And so you wind up with this sort of Scylla and Charybdis problem. And so you have to have a new system, but before a new system, again, if you make the system too overspecified and rigid, then you're right back to the DSM problem that people feel as though you are stifling innovation, and that system can quickly fail to keep up with the progress of the science. On the other hand, if the system is too underspecified and you don't give people enough guidelines, you have a lack of calibration and review and sort of anarchy, and again, people don't agree on what they're evaluating and how they evaluate it, and so the whole thing can sort of fail. So by having these constructs and specifying behavioral and physiological components for a construct, but leaving open development and environment, we've tried for people to do what they want. We've tried to hit the happy medium, but I think that's important to understand in overall how we set up the RDOC system to be a flexible framework. So I hope that gives you an idea of where we're going with the future, and in many ways I feel as though personality disorders, even though I know there's been a lot of worry and angst in the community, is actually a leader in this regard. So let me just give you a little sense of the examples we have. Currently we have about 36 or so funded grants in the personality disorders area, which is better than one might expect. And I've heard comments informally from many of you that personality disorder investigators, and especially in borderline, are kind of concerned about putting in grants because they don't know what NIMH wants and they're afraid they won't get funded. But in fact, I think you don't need to have that much concern. I mean, obviously, it's hard to get a grant in any area these days. But let me just give you examples of 3 grants that I think reflect where we're going. And certainly many of our grants explicitly look at borderline, just as one example, but again, break down things within borderline. But here are some grants that cut across diagnoses in interesting ways. And the first is to Dr. Konigsberg, who I imagine is there this morning, and I'm listing the actual grant number, and you can find these in the NIH Reporter system. If you simply Google NIH Reporter, you can find this information, so I'm not giving anything confidential out here or behind the screens, simply publicly available information. But this is a very nice study about regulating emotional responses to spoken comments and visual images with respect to affective instability and using fMRI. It's a transdiagnostic approach, and the sample, in fact, includes a range of diagnoses, including individuals who simply self-identify for affective instability. And again, it implements the kind of healthy control group that we have advocated in RDOC, that these are not super healthy controls with no history of disorder, but yet rather people who are currently healthy but may have had some problems in the past. And we think that has a better chance to give one a dimension that you can explore to look at these cut points and this, how things break out between people who are struggling and a little bit impaired but functioning and those who tend to be deteriorating.
So we're very excited about that study. Another grant is only in R21, a pilot study to Evelyn Verona in South Florida. She is studying transdiagnostic processes of emotional aggression. And here, this one nicely exemplifies the point I made that we encourage people to study interactions of constructs. This is the interplay of negative valence and cognitive systems. Again, this one embodies a transdiagnostic approach with a community sample and high-risk participants for aggression. And the aim of the study is to look at causal relationships, in fact, between events in the cognitive and affective systems. And finally, number 3 is actually a postdoc grant to Amy Bird at Pittsburgh. And so this is very promising to see young investigators coming on, and she's actually working with Dr. Stephanie Stepsar, one on emotional instability as precursors of borderline. And this one is titled Risk for Reactive Aggression into Adolescence, Emotional Reactivity in Parenting. So this one is exemplifying the developmental trajectories that I mentioned, because she's studying this transition into adolescence and this extreme emotional instability and reactive aggression that goes along with that. And again, this is this short-term longitudinal study that seems promising at this point, rather than the old 20, 30-year developmental studies. And we used to use longitudinal studies where the way funding goes these days, we're more interested in these relatively short time frames. So this looks at the trajectories of the transition into adolescence studied over 18 months and interactions with parents and the children. And the sample criteria include, for instance, an emotional reactivity screener rather than looking at people diagnosed with any particular diagnosis. So I think those are 3 excellent examples at all levels, in R01 and R21 and a postdoc grant, of the way that people can go. And so we encourage you to talk to program staff. We are very interested in this area, and I think in many ways, as I'll state in this final slide, that personality disorders actually can be a leader for the way NIMH is going, and not sort of an outlier, an area that is struggling. Actually, before I get to the final slide, I just wanted to mention that there are clear clinical approaches for this in clinical trials rather than enrolling subjects on the basis of a diagnosis. The idea would be, from an RDOC approach, to actually enroll patients based on measurable impairment in the specific mechanism or dimension of interest, whether that's excessive fear, working memory, or, as you've seen in these past grants, things like affective instability or problems with emotion regulation. And then, of course, the outcome measures would similarly be based on changes in those specific functions rather than overall diagnostic criteria changes in a diagnostic class. Also, as that implies, we're seeing more emphasis on functioning, especially in a quantifiable sense, rather than symptom reports. And I think that's an important trend in many areas of psychiatry that we've seen. And a good example of this, I think, is that both the European EMA and our FDA have signaled that they are willing to consider cognition as an indication in depression, following the earlier cognition as an indication for schizophrenia, as reflected in the MATRIX test battery. So that we are actually looking at ways to measure cognition, and obviously that's going to be a quantifiable measure. In fact, our RDOC group has interacted a lot with the FDA CEDAR group in talking about how you would measure cognition and depression, different aspects of cognition, designs, and so forth. So we've had a healthy collaboration with them about this. So finally, to summarize, I think to put RDOC in the perspective of this narrative arc that I've tried to describe, the goal of RDOC is not to be an alternative nosology or to be something fixed that people should try. Rather, it's to generate a research literature that it can inform future versions of the ICD and the DSM. So we hope that as things go forward, for instance, some of the questions about personality disorders, as an example, that led to the new ideas not being generated and put into the main DSM could be resolved through further research and the kind of research we'd like to study with these dimensional approaches, and again, stemming from very basic functioning. I should say that we're collaborating actively with the APA in this regard. Our former Deputy Director Phil Long has gone to the APA, as most of you know, and Dr. Diana Clark has been there for several years, has been working with Phil. They're very interested in creating a learning healthcare network that would be of use to practicing psychiatrists. And they're very interested in the use of RDOC-like dimensions that could be applied with this. And they're really looking for an active collaboration. And we're just starting to set that up with them now that Dr. Wong has been away for more than a year. And we can talk to them without having the ethics people complain. So I think what we're going to see about this is that what we've seen so far, just as you saw from some of those example graphs, is that we're not just chucking the DSM or the ICD and going off on something different. Rather, I think quite sensibly and reasonably what we want to see is incremental change, that we gradually see people looking at these dimensions within one DSM disorder across a grouping. Again, personality disorders represent an excellent example. So we're going to see more of these specific dimensions and subgroups within particular categories, but over time, I think we'll see this happening within broader syndromes. And again, this reflects the kinds of things we see in personality disorder with internalizing as a broad class, or perhaps distress disorders, or looking at manifestations of externalizing, and perhaps that might become to be called behavioral regulation disorder or something like that. But then within that, looking at particular facets or dimensions, we will come up with more individualized treatment plans. And so I think in the future, personality disorders, because of your recent history, actually could be a leader here. And I say that because clearly the process that went on for DSM-5, even though it was not ultimately successful, and the process that went on for the ICD-11, which looks like it will be successful, reflect a lot of these trends to looking at basic functions and how their dysregulations can become what we consider as disorders in a dimensional way. I think RDOC, I hope you can see from that view, is simply an extension of that, trying to integrate a lot of the biology into that as well and put all of the stuff together. And so I really like to think that you're a leader and not somebody who's struggling to make sense of this, but rather you have an important role. And so I hope you'll all feel encouraged to continue a dialogue with NIMH and work with program staff about coming in with many more grant applications in this area. So that's all I wanted to say. I don't know if we have time for any questions. We are right at the 10:15 mark, but if there's a way to relay any questions, I'd be happy to address them. And thank you again for putting up with this somewhat unique mode of presentation this morning.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.